Hello everyone and welcome to my session, a deep dive into the discovery of a Safari vulnerability. This is a vulnerability affecting Safari on macOS that we discovered earlier this year, allowing for a full Gatekeeper bypass. We reported our findings to Apple and they credited us with the following CVE. So I'm excited to get into the details and I'll get started. So now, my name is Ferdous Saljooki. I'm a detections developer working for Jamf Threat Labs. I also build detections for Jamf Protect, and I'm really interested in macOS internals as well as macOS malware. You can find me on LinkedIn and on Twitter. So we will be going over a number of things today. We'll go over what Gatekeeper is, some previous Gatekeeper bypasses discovered by other researchers. We'll also get into how we discovered this vulnerability. We'll get into something called the bomb framework, which is related to this vulnerability, as well as exploiting Gatekeeper via Safari. And finally, we'll wrap up with detections with ESF, or Apple's Endpoint Security Framework. So Gatekeeper is a security feature that is built into macOS that ensures only trusted software runs on the system. And it does this by verifying notarization and code signing information. For those of you that don't know, notarization is a review process in which a developer submits their software to Apple and it is scanned to ensure it is free of malicious code. Gatekeeper blocks unsigned or revoked applications from executing as well. So today we'll focus on a number of bypasses to get around this functionality altogether. So this is the prompt that you typically see when you're executing an unsigned or ad hoc signed application. The user can simply cannot execute it. They have to move it to trash or cancel the prompt altogether. So when applications are downloaded from the internet, macOS aims to apply something called a quarantine attribute. It adds this attribute as the com.apple.quarantine attribute. All of Gatekeeper's functionality revolves under the assumption that this quarantine attribute will exist. Without this quarantine attribute, macOS cannot know whether the application is local to the system or has been downloaded from, like, let's say, a remote resource. When the user first attempts to open a file that contains this quarantine attribute, so essentially anything downloaded from the internet, macOS will launch the process in a suspended state. The system will perform a number of complex checks on the file, and this is designed to trigger the appropriate alert or prompt. There's also whitelist and blacklist policies. This is enforced through the system policy database. The LS quarantine database also plays a role in storing quarantine information from downloaded files. There's also code signing and team ID information, as I mentioned, and notarization checks, which are enforced by Gatekeeper. The quarantine attribute essentially consists of 4 elements, consists of a flag, a date, the agent in which downloaded it, the application, as well as a UUID, which corresponds to the entry in the database. So file quarantine plays a role in requesting the user's explicit permission before executing software downloaded from the internet and when launched for the very first time. So without file quarantine and Gatekeeper, any downloaded file could be launched. There would be no code signing requirements enforced, and malware could essentially execute freely on the system. URI schemes would also be really effective. So there's also some limitations. These limitations are by design and not necessarily bypasses. However, it is important to be aware of the known limitations to be able to distinguish between a legitimate bypass. So some file systems do not support extended attributes. Let's say, for example, USB drives. You can simply plug in a USB drive, execute an application. Quarantine attributes are set by the agent application. What that means is that applications that already exist on the system, such as applications such as Slack, or WhatsApp would have any content that's downloaded from those would also they would also apply a quarantine attribute. In the past, malware has leveraged those sorts of platforms to distribute their malware. Curl and wget utilities on macOS are not subject to those same quarantine checks. There's file type exceptions as well. There is various files such as images, PDFs, and text files are considered to be safe files, so they're allowed to simply execute. There's also Office macros, which are sandboxed on macOS. There's been previous bypasses that escape the sandbox as well. And finally, scripts executed from the command line. This is not subject to the same gatekeeper checks, since at that point you'd be executing something from the command line, you already have access to the system. There's a number of ways you can actually override Gatekeeper. This is overriding Gatekeeper by design. This is by design, so users that know what they're doing can still allow unsigned software to run on the system. You can manually clear the quarantine attributes using the xadder command. There's also the social engineering method, which I like to call the right-click open method, that Schlaer notoriously uses to distribute its malware. And finally, you can disable Gatekeeper altogether using the system policy control command, which requires sudo. This is just an example of Schlaer overriding Gatekeeper. You have the Schlaer malware simply social engineering the user to get them to right-click and open to override Gatekeeper, and they're prompted accordingly that they're overriding their system settings to, and they could be potentially exposing their system to malware. There's also various macOS file types. I won't get into all of them, but just the most common, I think, is the app, the DMG, and the PKG. All typically require a valid signature, or it needs to be notarized in some way. You also have shell scripts, Python, JXA, which is JavaScript automation, Apple script. These all require a sort of a delivery mechanism. You can't simply just execute Python on the system. You typically have it within an application it's a Python wrapper that invokes Python. So now we'll get into some of the previous Gatekeeper bypasses. The first one is involving Symlinks. This was discovered by Ron Masses of Breakpoint, and it's also been patched in macOS 12.1. So this bypass leverages symbolic links in Automator. You simply open Automator, build an automation script. It could be any automation script. You export that automation as an application, and the important part is that you'd be replacing the stub binary with a symbolic link pointed to system library core services, and you zip that application, send it to the victim to download. So what that looks like is that you typically have an application structure like this, and within this application structure, as we mentioned, you'll have the Automator application stub, and this Automator application stub will invoke the workflow document, and this contains our shell script. Now, to bypass Gatekeeper, we'd simply remove this executable and we'd replace it with a symbolic link to the one located under core services. And what that looks like is simply the following structure. And this will actually allow you to bypass file quarantine, Gatekeeper, as well as notarization checks altogether. So really cool. The next bypass we'll look at is the one I like to call as scripts as apps. This was discovered by Cedric Owens and has been patched in macOS 11.3. Now, this bypass involves shell scripts as applications. You simply build any shell script, give it execute permissions. You'd create an app structure without an info.plist. This is required for the exploit to work. And you place the shell script within the app. No Malco binary is required. And you finally ensure that the shell script and app name match, package the application, and send it to the victim for download. So what that looks like is that you typically have an application structure like this, but this time we won't have an info.plist. And simply having a structure like this that's going to be downloaded from the internet will allow you to bypass Gatekeeper checks. Cedric Owens was able to discover a shorter, easier way to trigger this bypass by simply renaming the POC shell script as an app. So this would essentially be POC.app, which is a shell script itself. User would simply double click on it, bypassing all checks again. In the past, we've seen malware such as Schlaer leveraging Gatekeeper bypasses to infect systems. So malware authors see value in these types of vulnerabilities that bypass system controls. In this case, we see the Schlaer malware that modified their social engineering technique to simply get the user to double click as if this was a signed and notarized application, which it clearly is not. As you can see, it's a shell script that's executing within the application itself. Jamf Threat Labs was able to identify this being abused in the wild last year. The next bypass technique is really similar to the one we just covered, and this is what I like to call the interpreterless method. And this was discovered by Gordon Long, also patched in macOS 11.3. So very similar to the previous one, except this time we're using an interpreterless script-based application. So what that means is that you'd be removing the interpreter portion of it, so the bin bash. So you just contain the shebang header within the shell script itself. So what that looks like, again, we won't have an info.plist, and this time we have the contents of our shell script contains, typically would contain this, but instead we'll remove the interpreter portion of it. So what we'll be left with is just a shebang header, simply opening calculator, which is allowed to bypass all of Gatekeeper checks again. Now, there's many more Gatekeeper bypasses. I won't get into all of them, but it's interesting to see how Gatekeeper is developing over the years. So now I'm going to be talking about a new Gatekeeper bypass that we found earlier this year affecting Safari downloads and the BOM framework. We reported our findings to Apple, and in macOS 12.3, Apple patched the issue and assigned the following CVE. We are continuing to research new ways to bypass Gatekeeper checks, but today we'll focus exclusively on this Safari Gatekeeper bypass. Apple also credited another researcher by the name of Mickey Jin in this CVE. However, his approach was slightly different than ours, as he focused on leveraging a gzip archive to bypass Gatekeeper. We will explore both methods, zip and gzip, to bypass Gatekeeper checks from Safari. This, as I mentioned, patched in macOS 12.3. So what this looks like, in Safari, you have by default enabled a feature that will automatically extract archives. And in this case, we simply download an archive from our Dropbox, and we can see it's been extracted within our downloads folder, and simply double clicking, no prompts whatsoever. And the user is able to bypass file quarantine, Gatekeeper, as well as notarization checks altogether. So while exploring games on itch.io, we discovered something interesting. We were downloading zip files that seemed to be unsigned and unnotarized, but would bypass Gatekeeper. So what is itch.io? It's essentially a website that hosts a large number of third-party macOS applications. Many independent game developers host their games here. So after downloading and opening a handful of games, we noticed that many would not trigger an alert from Gatekeeper. So this made us very curious, because not only were these applications being downloaded from the internet, but most were completely unsigned. And we have no reason to believe that the creators of itch.io or the game developers were aware of this particular bug. So what this looks like is that when an application is typically downloaded, as we mentioned before, the com.apple.quarantine extended attribute gets applied to the application as well as the contents within the application itself. However, in this case, when we were downloading applications or games from this website, we noticed that the quarantine attribute would not be applied to the application itself, in this case test.app, but it would be applied to the contents within it. However, this still allowed it to bypass all of Gatekeeper's checks. So here we have an application that we downloaded from itch.io. We simply check that it is unsigned, and of course it's unnotarized. Looking at the extended attributes, we see that there's no extended attributes on the application itself, but we do notice an extended attribute, the com.apple.quarantine attribute, applied to the binary contained within the application. So we did a simple check. We downloaded this application from the Chrome browser, and of course it was rejected by Gatekeeper. We downloaded it from the Firefox browser, it was rejected by Gatekeeper again. However, downloading it from Safari, it was able to bypass all of Gatekeeper's checks. So this was very interesting. It turns out Safari has a feature called Open Save Files after downloading. This is enabled by default, and save files are considered to be like pictures, PDFs, text documents, as well as archives that will auto-extract. So particularly zip and gzip archives are supported in Safari. And indeed, we were downloading a zip archive from Safari with that feature enabled by default. So to pinpoint the vulnerability, developers are encouraged to use an open source Golang command line tool called Butler. This tool allows them to easily manage the games which are hosted on their account. So Butler analyzes an uploaded application and rezips it before hosting it for download. And we surmised the way in which it was rezipping the application. It was causing the bypass to accidentally occur. Users would simply go and visit the developer's page on itch.io and simply download their application or game. So look, for testing purposes, we built an application and ran it through Butler command line tool. After trying a few different combinations, we were indeed able to skip the Gatekeeper prompts with our custom zip file, which was downloaded through Safari. And in a zip archive, we have local headers. These are denoted by the bytes 54B0304. And we noticed something that's quite interesting. In the standard zip archive that we created that isn't able to bypass Gatekeeper, the first local file header is pointed to test.app. In the one that was able to bypass Gatekeeper, the Butler one, the first local file header is pointed to test.app/contents. So this is quite interesting. So what we can simply do is we removed all the bytes from the first local header to the second local header, and we were able to get a very similar looking zip file that was able to bypass Gatekeeper checks on macOS. So how was it that this website was accidentally bypassing Gatekeeper? To better understand the issue at hand, we first need to have some background on the BOM or bill of materials and how that plays a role in extracting an archive. These objects are used in many different places by Apple to keep a running list of file paths when a major file transaction occurs. For example, like if an individual sends a directory to another user over AirDrop, a temporary BOM file is created on the sender system that holds a record of all the files that were sent in that transaction. Ditto, LSBOM, and MakeBOM also leverage the BOM, so we'll get into those shortly. So BOM items can even be saved to files in binary format using the makebom command. Many power users are familiar with the system library receipts directory, which holds a list of BOM files. The name of the BOM file tells you what software was installed or updated. Looking inside the BOM file tells you which files were created by that software. So using the lsbom command line utility, BOM files can be printed on screen. Package installers also leverage the BOM, and you can actually extract BOM files from the PKG, which is exactly what we'll do. In this case, we have the Zoom installer PKG, and we'll extract the contents of that, and we can see what Zoom is going to be installing. As mentioned earlier, if the quarantine attribute gets applied to files or folders under the test.app directory, Gatekeeper is not triggered. The application itself is all Gatekeeper looks for. So we determined the easiest way to sort of confuse the BOM function is by ensuring that the root of the application is not the first local file header of the zip. In other words, we want to ensure that the application, the test.app application, is not contained within the BOM itself. In this case, applications downloaded from itch.io were often able to bypass Gatekeeper checks because the root of the application was not contained within the BOM during the extraction of the archive. To craft the bypass, we can simply use the zip command line utility, create a simple application, and instead of modifying the bytes in a hex editor, we can simply use this following zip command to craft a zip archive that will bypass Gatekeeper checks. Instead, we're pointing it at test.app/contents so that the test.app portion of it is not contained within the BOM. We'd host this on a web server and download it from Safari. Now, crafting the bypass, we can just see the simple commands that we can use for a POC here. So what that looks like is that the Calm the Apple Safari sandbox worker process is actually responsible for extracting the archive and rewriting it and applying the quarantine attribute. So It contains a function called a class called WBS download file on archiver, containing two essential functions: download file bomb on archiver and download file gzip on archiver. One, of course, is for zip archives, the other is for gzip. We'll focus first on the bomb on archiver, and then we'll get into the gzip. So within the Safari shared private framework, we can see that the function is clearly is copying the quarantine attribute. However, it's copying the quarantine attribute incorrectly. And we'll look at this in a moment. So using the same zip command to bypass Gatekeeper, we see that we pointed at test.app/contents, and the quarantine attribute gets applied to the contents directory as well as recursively to all the other items within it. But it doesn't get applied to the test.app itself. Taking this a step further, we can see that if we point it at test.app/content/macOS and then download it from the internet, upon extraction, we see that there's no quarantine attribute applied to test.app or on the contents folder. Similarly, we can point it at the binary itself, in this case test, and we see that no quarantine attributes are being applied, only being applied to the binary itself, which we pointed it at. So this can further be seen via the Ditto executable, which is a built-in utility on macOS for making exact copies of files. Ditto can be used to create archives as well as extract archives. And Ditto actually suffers from the same bomb issue that Safari does. In fact, if we use a different browser to download the same test application used above, we can then use the Ditto utility to unarchive the zip file, resulting in the same lack of quarantine extended attribute. Now, looking at a debugger, we can see that Ditto calls a function within the private bomb framework called bomb copy or copy with options. We can clearly see that all the values are set to true, including the copy quarantine value. Therefore, we know that the quarantine attribute is indeed being applied, but is set incorrectly based on the bomb, which in our case, we were able to manipulate the zip archive in a way to exclude the root of the application from it. So if we can keep our application's root directory off of this list of files, the extended attribute will not be applied to it. The bomb is used to determine which files or directories would require the quarantine attribute when an archive is being extracted. Next, we'll look at the download file gzip on archiver, and this of course applies to gzip archives. So again, crafting the bypass, we can simply use this time the zip and gzip command line utilities. We'll create a simple application again, create a zip archive for that application, and we'll also create a gzip archive for the zipped app. And then downloading the archive from Safari, and of course open save files, which is enabled by default, that also has to be enabled for this to work. Again, this is a proof of concept for the commands you can execute to exploit Gatekeeper for the gzip. So we could see we simply create the application, in this case running a shell script, give it execute permissions, and use the zip and gzip commands to create the archive accordingly. So now looking to see like how to compare what that looks like with the zip archive. So the gzip archive, you can see that there's no quarantine attributes pretty much applied anywhere. The application itself has no quarantine attribute, as well as the contents within it. So as I mentioned, Gatekeeper only really cares that if the application itself is being executed, whether it contains a quarantine attribute or not. In this case, it does not contain a quarantine attribute, so it also bypasses all of Gatekeeper's checks. So looking at the download file gzip on archiver function within the Safari shared framework, we can see that it writes the data without setting the quarantine attribute at all. Now, if we compare that with the patch version, we can see that the same function now sets the quarantine attribute based on the Safari copy quarantine properties from file at URL. So with the gzip, it essentially was not applying the quarantine attribute whatsoever. So Gatekeeper is a technology that exists on macOS that prevents unsigned or potentially unwanted software from executing on the system. And today we've discussed several bypasses for Gatekeeper, including ones that were previously discovered by researchers. Although Gatekeeper is not a perfect technology, it is continuing to improve over the years as Apple adds features and patches vulnerabilities. So today we've covered how we were able to get around Gatekeeper due to an issue in the BOM or bill of materials for when an archive is being extracted. We were able to see how critical the quarantine attribute is in order for Gatekeeper to perform its checks. In this case, we've seen the quarantine attribute being applied incorrectly, effectively resulting in a bypass of file quarantine, Gatekeeper, and notarization checks altogether. So next, we'll look at how we can detect this by monitoring the com.apple Safari sandbox broker process using the ESF. So leveraging Apple's endpoint security framework, we can begin to look for rename events. And then we can also look for where the process is the com.apple Safari sandbox broker process. And then additional check we can do to verify that this is an application by verifying the file has an app extension. Next, we'll go on to verify that Safari is that it's being moved from a temporary folder, which Safari does, and then writes it to the downloads folder. And then finally, the last check we'll do is once the file has finally been extracted, our application has been extracted, we could look up the extended attributes, and if there is no quarantine attribute present on the application itself, this all in all will trigger a detection alert. So we've observed this bypass working as far back as Safari 14.0.2 on macOS Big Sur. We've been monitoring this bypass in the wild, and we have no indication of in the wild exploitation for this specific Gatekeeper bypass affecting Safari downloads. And again, this is definitely update to the latest version of macOS. This has been patched in macOS 12.3 or Safari 15.4. You can also disable open save files in Safari to prevent this bypass from happening, as well as monitor downloads, specifically applications contained within archives by monitoring the com.apple Safari sandbox broker process. And finally, you can also check the attributes when an app is extracted and verify that it does contain the com.apple.quarantine extended attribute. Thank you all for listening, and enjoy the rest of your JNUC.